Hello everyone. Long time no see for this kind of format. So today we have another episode of OSS Power-Ups, and today we're going to talk about AngleSharp together with the maintainer, Florian Rappl. I'm very excited already. Before we get to the real meat of this, first things first, if you have any questions, feel free to post them in the chat in YouTube or Twitch as well, because we're streaming there as well. Of course, we will try to address those questions as we go or at the end of the stream, depends on the question. Also, this webinar is going to be recorded just at this particular moment already. So if for any reason you have to drop out, feel free to continue later. But of course, we are very happy if you stay around with us and dive with us into AngleSharp. A few words about the format and the program that we have here. First off, let's discuss very briefly about open source in the .NET community. So what we see is that organizations, and that's not just limited to .NET, largely benefit from open source projects. Contrary to that, unfortunately, contributions are rather insufficient in most cases. So maintainers spend a lot of time, but many times all that they get is new issues. And so from that, we kind of can agree and can agree that sustainability is a large problem in the open source space. And of course, also maintainers are at risk because of that, facing burnouts and all kinds of things. Yeah. So that's the reason why some months, years ago, we at JetBrains thought we could come up with a program, which is this one, power-upping.net open source development. And what we provide in this format, and usually I should say, notably, these are not just projects that we use. Actually, so far, this is the 11th episode, I think. Only 2 of them are actually used in our products. So we basically pick promising projects from the ecosystem and try to help them. And how do we help them? That is with $100 per month for a full year. Also, we try to share our personal strengths, which is usually something around profiling, creating graphics, CI/CD implementation, and plugins. I usually do the plugins. Something else that I want to show you is a couple of months back, we had Martin investigating Quest PDF in the pursuit of performance. And we also Martin found quite a few things that helped the project to perform better. And of course, also, we want to give a platform for the projects and also raise awareness about the problem for open source development. One thing that I want to share here, and I hope you can just grab the title and then search for it. I often, or so far I did 2 talks about open source, like a full-blown talk about this topic. But one thing that I want to share is this blog post here about how to talk to your company about sponsoring an open source project. So maybe that is something for you. How to motivate management and hire up people to invest in open source, maybe with money, maybe with time. So yeah, if you're interested, go check out that blog post. Other than that, I'm very excited to introduce our today's guest, which is Florian, maintaining AngleSharp. So let me add him to the stream. Hi, Florian.
Hello.
Let me also remove this. Very nice to have you here. I'm also very honored, of course. You are a remarkable figure in the .NET open source space. So maybe you introduce yourself.
Thanks, Matthias. Much appreciated. So my name is Florian Rappl. I'm a solution architect working at a smaller company called smapiot. It's quite often the most difficult thing to get for people. What is that? Smapiot? Yes, it's a smart APIs for IoT, but besides doing work, creating IoT platforms, helping in the areas of security and scalability, I'm specialized myself in distributed web applications. So these days doing a lot of front-end development, especially using the micro front-end pattern. But make no mistake, my origins and my heart is all at .NET and C#, and still maintaining AngleSharp after all those years. So yeah, it's
two questions already. And now, unfortunately, this year was a bit too late, but you also organize a conference, an online conference, right? For micro front ends. So maybe next year, or you want to say something about it, maybe?
Yeah, we had it exactly, I think, on the date 1 month ago. So 12th of June was the date. We held the first ever micro frontends conference. It was beyond our expectations. I had a wild dream of having, let's say, between 500 and 600 registrations. I was hoping for the 500 mark. In the end, it was 1,500, so we tripled that. It was quite great, and so also the stream was very well viewed. I think our peak viewer number was around 200, and right now I think the video stream also has 3K views already. So it's beyond what we imagined. We had a great speaker lineup, and in general, I think it went very smooth for the first time ever organizing. Not only a conference, but an online conference. Yes, was the first time.
That was the first time. Oh my God, that's mind blowing. Actually, I was about to ask for which episode that is. Yeah, because usually conferences they only get to those numbers over a couple of years, but that's very, very impressive.
Yeah.
Coming back to AngleSharp, I have one question. I thought I want to ask you. Do you have a rough approximation of how many hours you put into the project? So I should mention it since 2012. Yeah, I'm not sure. I think you mentioned it already.
I think that is very hard to estimate. I think there are some tools that look at how many commits and have been done, how many lines have been changed, and calculate the hours. And I did that a couple of years ago. It then calculates some price. I don't know, but it was then already priced at $1 million or so dollars. So I don't know what the hourly rate was, but so speaking of, let's say easily 10,000 hours, I think it's closer to the 100,000 mark than to the 10,000 mark. I would say quite some hours over the years. I mean, of course, there was some peak, presumably in the area 13 to 15. But nevertheless, it's just accumulating.
we should mention. I think it's 6,500 commits. Now that is really a lot, I think. Okay, but let's go with AngleSharp. We share your screen. I will stick around, ask my naive or stupid questions even. And also ask the questions from the audience if they have any. Let me just find your stream. You ready to share? Yeah?
Sure.
Yeah.
Let's bring it on.
Screen edit. I will put myself below you.
Awesome. Yeah, maybe let's start before I write any line of code. With some in the audience may wonder what is AngleSharp and what does it do? What can it help me with? So in a nutshell, AngleSharp is what I would call a browser engine. So this is, let's say, what every browser that you use, like Google Chrome, for instance, has under the hood working for you. This is the thing that can do, for instance, the requests to a web server, but can also then understand the HTML, bring it over in a model. And real browsers then have, of course, a lot of things on top of it. For instance, a rendering engine. AngleSharp doesn't have that. We are working on a rendering tree, and I had once a very crude CSS 2.1 compliant rendering engine working, but this is not the, let's say, scope and the aim of the project. It may be delivered in one of our libraries, but AngleSharp itself you would use if you need to interact with a website. So read out its information, for instance, do something, maybe even submit a form. This is where AngleSharp excels and can help you. How you can bring it in is via NuGet. So here in this example, I already brought it in. I think it should be listed via the packages. You can see it. It's AngleSharp 1.4. So we have had a quite big moment this year. After 10 years, we finally made a 1.0. And I mean, I promised like every year. It was like a running joke, I think. But then we were really ready. And since then, the ecosystem is following. There are 2 big milestones missing. We have a library called AngleSharp CSS, which is a plugin on top of AngleSharp to give CSS more understanding. That is not in 1.0.0 yet. And we also have AngleSharp JS. That's a little bit abandoned, but make no mistake, it's an interesting library and we want to bring it up again. And
I have to, Florian, I have to make one remark because that's so funny about the version 1.0. Like I also have this as an advice to start for an open source project with 1.0 because otherwise all kinds of people ask, is this production ready? And, you know, I mean, you started in 2012, yeah, and I assume it was okay to use, or yeah, even better probably, long before version 1.0, right?
Oh, of course. I mean, for me, the critical part was, did we see some breaking changes recently, or did we settle? And then it's really remained quite clear that also with .NET and the direction is there, we now settled essentially. So, I mean, that doesn't mean that there won't be a 2.0 and some breaking change, of course, and that we increment there, but yeah, it is at this point in time not really necessary. So if we bring up a 2.0, right, then it might be just because we found out something and it needs to break there, or because it's just so much nicer to do it this other way. But otherwise, if there is no compelling reason, we will not do a breaking change. I mean, we did that beforehand, but there was always something tiny coming up. And so we had these changes. We were following this pre-1.0 version scheme, but we still used then the major version as a, the minor version, sorry, as a new major, and so we went from, I don't know, 0.16 to 0.17 and so on and so forth.
Did the same.
And I mean, in the web development community, for instance, it's quite common. There are many things which are used in production for years and from also big companies, but they are pre-1.0. And React, as just one example of many, they went then, so they had to 0.15, to 0.14, sorry, and then they came up with the 15 something. So they just shifted it. So they never had a 1.0 release. They just shifted then, and to indicate that let's remove the 0 in front because people are going crazy otherwise. But I mean, not much has changed. I mean, of course, they had some breaking changes since then, but the production readiness was already proven beforehand. Usually it doesn't say so much, but I mean, I can get it. Some companies are really wild on it. But they then don't.
Now I feel like I derailed you.
Yeah.
About
it's fine, right? Anyway, so I just imported that, and with this, we can write some code here and do something like the hello world here, just using AngleSharp. So how would we do that? We can use the browsing context. What is that? A browsing context is essentially like your tab in the browser. It is not named arbitrarily. That's actual specs of browsers that implement tabs. They actually have a browsing context that follows the model given by the W3C, so the World Wide Web Consortium, that's actually handling all these specifications and trying to align the browser vendors to do something. So that's then the official embodiment of the WG, so the working group for the web. Anyway, so we always try to use some specs as a blueprint, because in our opinion, that makes the thing much more easy to use. If you already know web development and, I don't know a little bit about browsers and or JavaScript, then these things will all look and sound familiar and behave really familiar. If you don't know that, I mean, then it's anyway, it's a good entry-level truck, because someday you may enter web development and then you say, well, I already used AngleSharp, so I already know all these concepts and they also work the same. So coming up with a new concept, in my opinion, has not much advantages here. So we just follow the existing standards. That one has a method called new. Now it's strange. We could also use a constructor, but usually you just chain that, or this is one option. So yeah. We thought that this is maybe great. And you can optionally provide a configuration. We come to that in a second, what a configuration does, but so far let's just be explicit here instead of implicit. And maybe let's store that context somewhere to also see a little bit and maybe go through it step by step. All right, so now what can we do with this browsing context that we have here? Well, we can load some context and call it a document. And it's all async, of course. We won't need that now, I think. So we open asynchronously what? That's a good question. We could now go to a website, but let's save that for later. Another thing that we can do, we can create a so-called virtual response. So what is that, a virtual response? Well, instead of going to a real web server, we can just say, let's go to a virtual web server. So something that's not there. So we will not go out of any network or anything, but we have now the full repertoire of what a web server would respond with. So that's the response coming from a non-existing web server. So we could give it, for instance, an address, and we could say, well, that's happening now on some localhost port. Or we could even say that it's coming directly from google.com/foo. We don't care. I mean, it's just an address. It's not that we go there. It's just that is where the response comes from, right?
Kind of log, so to say.
Yes, exactly. I mean, at the end of the day, the model that we create here, so that we get back when we pass this, it contains also information of where it got this source from, right? And so in this case, it will just say it got this source from google.com/foo. If you just keep that free, maybe let's start here, it will just be localhost. I mean, it needs to have a starting value. It can't be just undefined or null. It's not in the set of options. Anyway, and now we can have hello world in here, right? And that's it. That's our content. That's our website. Maybe already start with something and put it in a div. I don't know. To just say this is HTML. Otherwise, it's way too close. And then we can do several things. The easiest thing to do is just get some HTML. I mean, that's the most unnecessary example ever. The HTML that we even constructed ourselves, right? And then what we write out to the console in this case is again HTML. But maybe let's just let it run and not do anything. But what we will see, and I just hit the breakpoint here, I will jump over it in a second, but what we will see is that the input here, this is just div hello world, will not match the outcome, right? Maybe let's just let it conclude here. And what we get is a little bit of boilerplate around it. Now you can say, well, where is this written? It's not written here. Well, that's right, but that's just a specification. So the specification will tell us, or tell in this case AngleSharp, what to do. And since the first thing AngleSharp sees is this div tag here, it will actually auto insert certain things, like for instance, HTML, head. Well, there's nothing in head, but then a body. And then is our content here, right? So these things, they will automatically enter the scene. And that's quite cool. You could even go a little bit further, right? And say, well, maybe I want to style this div. And I introduce a style. So again, this is non-rendering, so I can make the color blue. You will not see it in blue in my console. It will still be printed as is. But I could just say, well, let's have a color blue in here, right? Now, why I'm writing this is the rules for this insertion of these elements are not as simple as, well, it doesn't start with an HTML, so let's just make the structure as we see it down there. They're actually really based on what kind of elements you use. So for instance, if you use a style, that goes to the head. If you use a div, well, that goes to the body, right? And let's see if I'm right or wrong. And you see there's the head, and here you have inserted the style, but then in the body there is the div hello world. So magically, the parser already places the things at the right locations. It doesn't, let's say, just say, oh, it doesn't start with HTML, panic, panic. It really tries to match what is the expected outcome. And that is because, I mean, HTML5 was a buzzword for so long, and the specification is quite long. But most of the things that are, let's say, covered in the specification is not the happy case. It's not like, yeah, that's the beginning of an HTML element. Oh, that's how it's closed. No, it's really these errors. What can happen? What is the definition? What should happen if it doesn't start, for instance, with the preamble, with the angle bracket, exclamation mark, the doc type, HTML, for instance. What if it just starts with HTML? What if it starts with something else, like style in this case? How should it behave? And that's very well specified. And that was the great achievement of HTML5 at the end, because now all these errors in all the browsers, they behave the same. Beforehand, some browsers implemented something where they thought, well, in this case, it should do it like that. And others said, well, in this case, we think otherwise. I think what was actually meant is this, right? But with HTML5, that is just aligned. And that is why, in my opinion, yeah.
So it's kind of designed in a way to be more forgiving in a standardized way.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. I mean, HTML was always kind of forgiving, right? But it was not standardized, which was one of the problems. So a developer, maybe with good intentions, came up with something and said, well, it renders nicely in Netscape, so it must be right. But then Internet Explorer thought otherwise, and then people were like discussing, why is this website looking strange in Internet Explorer? Of course, the root reason was, the root cause here is that the website wasn't written correctly. But since HTML is quite a forgiving format, you've rarely seen it just an exception from your browser thrown in your face. HTML doesn't meet my expectations, so it must just work, and that's all defined in this error model. And this is why also AngleSharp chooses as a basis HTML5. There are other popular parsers out there, some of them really simple, but some of them, I mean, just based on, let's say, experience, I would call it, not on an official specification. And they, of course, for 90–95% of the websites work also fine. But what about the other 5%, right? And this is where you really want to have an engine that behaves the same way as, for instance, in Chrome, in Firefox, in Safari, you name it.
Yeah.
And this is what
I have one more question. There's this thing called doc type, right? Which basically says to what or if it adheres to the standard, right? Would those browsers still render something wrong in the old days, even if you said, I want to adhere to the standard? Or what would happen?
So if you don't specify the doc type, it automatically goes into the right mode. But I mean, having the doc type HTML in there is nevertheless, for a couple of reasons, good. There have been in the beginning something, if you don't have it, the browser might not activate the HTML5 parser. But right now, in all evergreen browsers, it means, you know, Chrome, Firefox, etc., the ones that you know, the HTML5 parser is just the default. So there's nothing bad happening. Gotcha. The only thing that you could screw up is if you use a certain doc type, and there are quite some old doc types out there that is not recognized, the browser is free to activate the so-called Quirks mode. And in Quirks mode, some things behave a little bit differently. But make no mistake, I mean, of course, it's up to the implementation of the browsers. But for instance, in AngleSharp, we only implement the HTML5 spec, and HTML5 spec also includes Quirks mode and when you should go into Quirks mode. So essentially, I mean, if browsers really have HTML5 engine, they all do these days, and if they take that seriously, they will only use that one, and then this thing will actually define when they enter Quirks mode. Yeah. But yeah, having the right doc type is certainly a good practice. It's quite often on the websites that I write by hand, so where I really write the HTML that goes out there, more or less the only thing that I write. Because then, I mean, you don't need HTML unless you want to have, let's say, an attribute like the language specified. That's a very common attribute, the lang attribute of HTML tag. And usually you don't write the head. An important tag, and you should do it quite early, is the meta tag for the encoding, setting usually to just UTF-8. But that is just, that must come really early, because if you place a website on a server that serves it with some, I don't know, strange encoding, that must come really early to indicate to the browser, hey, by the way, this site, this source code here is actually UTF-8. So whatever the server said, forget about this. And what the spec actually then tells to do is make a comparison, if anything already deviated. And if you do it as early as possible, I mean, first of all, if it really needs to restart, it's not so problematic. But second, the likelihood that there's already a mismatch between, that is what the server sent and what I interpreted with the encoding, and this is what now UTF-8 would give me on the same source, is very low. So therefore, you can just continue it. It will continue with UTF-8. But if you, for instance, already had a title, it's quite likely that, I don't know, there are some umlauts in there. We all know the old problems, right, with websites. Why this is looking so strange? Yeah. But right. The spec has this covered too, and that's one of the reasons why the meta tag should come quite early. And after that meta tag, you can make your title, should also come quite early. And then just a bunch of other meta tags, etc. They will always end up in the head, so it's all good. You don't need the head tag. And then you're already in your body, right? So you start with some div. So you also don't need to write a body tag unless you place something there, like, I don't know, a class or something that you, a CSS class, want to have there. Mm-hmm. Okay, so far so good. But just keep asking. I mean, I'm delighted always to talk about the HTML
all the time.
specification. Great. So now I want to have a little bit of a look at what you can do with this configuration. We're using the default configuration that comes with a very small set of capabilities already in there. Some conventions, etc. But you can come up with anything else. At the end of the day, what it has underneath is I wouldn't call it dependency injection, but something that goes in that direction. I always wish that dependency injection is, well, more accessible. I mean, now it is actually, but we are still using also dotnet. What is dotnet 4.5 or so compatibility here? So we can't really rely on anything with newer dotnet versions. Anyway. So what you can do is you can, for instance, tell it that it is allowed to make requests. And the way to do that is to say, as one example, others, to say with default loader. So what that will give you is a configuration that also has a so-called, I think the interface is iLoader, iDocument loader, yes. And this is essentially a way to allow making requests or allow AngleSharp to make requests. So now we can also drop this virtual request here, or virtual response. So yeah, that everything is not really leaving. And we could, for instance, go to my website. Yeah, I know, but it's one of the things that I mean, I don't exclude any robots, and so it should just work. And have a look here. So let me just run this. Hopefully this will work. Didn't forget anything. This might now take a little bit longer because first of all it needs to make the request, but let's say the 100 milliseconds is irrelevant. But there's a lot more now going on in memory. I'm streaming out. So
is there a robots.txt entry for ChatGPT already? I wonder.
I mean, if there is, then the next question would be, is it respecting that robots.txt? Because
yes, yeah, right.
It's always the one thing is the website saying don't index that, but the other is the search engine saying
I'm coming in anyway.
I respect that. Yeah, it's a Thanos. I respect that. Anyway, cool. So now let's maybe, before we give out the HTML, which would be way too much, let's inspect it maybe a little bit. So here we got our document, and that's an HTML document instance. And if you're familiar with web development, a little bit of the document object model, which is the representation in terms of such interfaces or .NET and classes, it will all look very, very familiar. For instance, there's a special property in there called all. They are just written usually in lowercase, of course, in the official specification for, tailored for JavaScript or such languages that use camel case. What we are doing is we are using Pascal case, so following the standard .NET convention. So it's just called capital A, L, all here. Right, but it's all looking very familiar. So you've got all these properties like title here, news, homepage of Rappl. Hey, that's me. So my homepage still works. Don't give it much love these days. It's one of the things that I had to sacrifice due to lack of time. But it's still out there, and they can still use it for these demo purposes. And maybe I even keep the design of the homepage to just say it always should look like 2010. And I can even tell my grandchildren I have a 2010 homepage.
That's true. I saw all the links to the social media accounts. They're really old.
Yeah, some of them, I mean, yes, don't get me started there. It's maybe a debate on its own, right? But anyway, so let's do maybe something with it. Let me make evaluate here. So let me evaluate expression and do a query selector all here. And what I want to get is, let me say, all diffs, for instance. So I run this, and what I get back is quite some diffs, 67 diffs on this page. That's okay. That's normal, I would say. I mean, there are quite some user items there, and I would say standard websites may even have more. And a website could handle thousands of diffs also moving around in a frame. So that's not good. But maybe let's say I want some particular subset of that. Now, for instance, class list, though there's nothing in there, but I know for sure that some of them are tabs. So I think I use the class tab. So what you can write is a so-called CSS selector. AngleSharp has full support for that. So what it allows you to do is just say not only elements like diff, but also with the dot name syntax matching these classes. So in this case, the class tab is matched, but only if it's a diff element, right? So let's see if there are some. Wait, we got 4. Well, that's less, but there must be some. Let's see. So that's just tab. That's tab clearfix. So we could even, I mean, go in there and pick something like this, for instance. So say, hey, we want the diff, any diff that has the tab class, and because it's just chained, the clearfix class. And what we get back is one element here. So this is this thing. Great. We are done here, right? You could also say anything that follows then, and let's see if that also works. Is there something in? Yeah, there are quite some elements in there. So you can, of course, go crazy if you know all these CSS selectors. They're quite powerful. They have been a little bit less powerful in XPath, maybe, which is why some people preferred those syntaxes in the past. But these days, they really they brought in some new pseudo selectors, which make it, I would say, on par.
I was just about to ask, because usually I was always using XPath for those things, but usually dealing with just XML. And would you say one is more used or more fancy and hyped these days? So is this CSS selectors probably?
I mean, for us, it of course makes sense with CSS selectors because that's the thing that you have also available on the web. These are, I mean, of course, well specified for the DOM. In the .NET world, I would say XPath is still more common because working with XML is a little bit more common, and XPath, I think, is also directly supported from the system XML namespaces. So I think coming from that angle, XPath might be, or at least from what I see, is more popular. But yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, I guess it's a little bit about personal preference. Since I work quite a lot in web development, I know for sure CSS selectors a lot better, and that's why I just prefer them, right? So it's for me an easy pick, but you might pick different for other and also valid reasons.
Gotcha.
Cool. So again, we can just grab something, and we have the full document object model at our disposal. But we can do even a little bit more here. So AngleSharp, of course, it has now all this information gathered. It requested the homepage here. It parsed the code, following, of course, all the rules. And it allowed me now also to query, make some, get some information out of this website. So that's all great so far. But I am also capable through AngleSharp to manipulate that website and again spit it out in form of HTML or something else. So if we look here at, for instance, a document body, let's make the following. Let's look at the child nodes. These are all nodes, not just elements, right? So you got here text nodes in there and whatnot. You see that we got these 15 nodes. So it's fine. And let's say I want to add another div at the end of the HTML body, right? So what can I do? Well, I could just say, for instance, I append a child, And what I want to append is, for instance, the document create element of a div. And I think the parentheses are balanced here, so let's try that. I mean, I did it. So let's have another look at the child nodes. And we see we now got a div element here at the end of it, right? So it worked. That's good. And we can do these manipulations, right? So everything that you can do, for instance, in JavaScript, interacting with the document object model, you can do in AngleSharp.
Florian, I have to say one thing. Unfortunately, on the stream, it looks like your cursor is duplicated, and back office said once you click, it disappears, or you use the keyboard. So whenever you point to something, maybe click once, and then the shadowing and the duplication of the cursor should disappear. But
okay.
It's weird. I don't know why. I had it too some time ago.
See. I see that the cursor stands here, and once I click, it's okay. It is a strange behavior. Just move the mouse out of the screen.
That also works.
All right. Cool. I hope it's not too annoying for the audience, but
I think it's good, but I have to say I was just not attentive the last minute, so I cannot ask any questions. So let's go on.
Great. Okay. Cool. So far so good. Let's stop this here, and maybe let's do another round of trying to see what, let's say, Pitfalls AngleSharp saves you from in HTML. And I will try to move out my mouse and actually work with the keyboard here. We can keep with the default loader. It doesn't matter at this point in time. So again, let's just say we come up with some content, and that is like a pop quiz. What happens with content like this? Hello, world. Who knows the answer? What's your guess? Any guesses?
I must be honest, I watched this in another presentation already, so I know that it will add the closing paragraph tags.
That's right. So there are some scoping rules, and they apply, for instance, to paragraphs, and they also apply to other things where it's useful. So as an example, I'd say, well, let's just keep it like that. I make an unsorted list, and I have here 2 list elements, right? So let me just let that run really quickly and get the output. And what you see is we got our unsorted list, which, by the way, also closes. Everything that's still open at the end just closes. I mean, it's how you expect it potentially, but the specification could also throw it away, right? Could say, I've never seen the closing tag of that, I'll throw it away. But that's the way that they went for, and I think it's a good way. And then you have in here 2 list items. So they're properly closed here, because in there, this is just a serialization of it, right? So you can serialize it however you want to. This uses a default serializer. If you hover over the to.html extension, there is actually an iMarkup formatable underneath, and you can provide, so anything that has this interface you can format, and what you can provide, or what makes it possible to bring it in is, let me just use this as an example. I'm not sure why it but anyway. So you can provide a formatter that you like to. So for instance, here I say pretty markup formatter, and I think, let's see if that makes a difference. It should auto introduce things. No, it doesn't. Oh, it's a shame. Usually what it, maybe I think that's anyway the default. Yeah, anyway, should have selected maybe the example better, but what it does is it tries to make it as beautiful as possible. I guess here the problem is it would change actually the meaning of it, because what usually happens is that text nodes, they also carry I mean, can carry a meaning. And so if you have a space in between, that's rendered. So as an example, if you would have the following, I don't know, hello. Let's write it like this. Hello. And then let me just write it differently. I write it like this. So great. Move this one. Okay. So don't want to confuse everyone, but essentially
raw strings. Raw strings. There's a context action for that. I know that.
And like this, right? Now, if you, maybe let's have something surrounding here that it really makes sense. Let's make a div around it, right? And let's not care about the spaces that we have here and here. The important one is in here. So if I would now cut this thing out and move it somewhere, for instance, in JSX in a React code base, and you would ask React developers, does this thing do the same as an HTML? I would say 99 out of 100 will say, yes, it is the same. The thing is, JSX is a little bit more, let's call it meaningful or less meaningful, depending on the angle that you look at it. It was geared for development. And the reason is that they, or the React team, when they started to introduce JSX, they knew it is about development. It's not about what will be the end result, but it's about what you write, that you can read it. So when you have this mindset, then suddenly the whole structure that I give it here, right, that I have, let's say, 2 spaces here, and then suddenly this is again at the same level as this div. This is rather for me visually to see already how this thing is structured, right? This is not for the outcome. And so what, for instance, React does is it removes all the prefixed and the suffixed, or the leading and the trailing spaces. So the end result is that in React, these spaces wouldn't be there, right? But that means, for instance, that we lose this new line and the spaces here. Now, if you have this outcome in HTML, let me just run it. Then the end result is quite easy. We need to keep these spaces. Some of them are removed, okay, but that's fine. Because the reason is we don't know what the rendering model of CSS does. That now depends if it's, for instance, block or inline block, etc., etc. But here it is quite easy because we have a block, it's a div, and in here we only have inline blocks. Actually, these are 2 inlines, but it doesn't matter if it's inline block or inline, they're just inline. And we have the strong and the italic, the bold and the italic. And so what will happen in a rendering is that you will see a space in between, which is what you're used to. I mean, it doesn't matter here if it's a new line in 20 spaces, it's just 1 space at the end of the day when it renders out on the screen. Mm-hmm. But again, that makes a difference. If I would now remove this part here, you wouldn't have any space in between, and the rendering also wouldn't contain the space, right? Which is the reason why you can't just insert or remove spaces arbitrarily. What you can do, though, is that you, let's say, minimize it and that you reduce it to a single space. And that is, for instance, I think done by the minify markup formatter. Let's see. And it follows such rules, and hopefully this works. No, maybe I'm not using the right thing. Why is it so many? Okay. So I'm either stupid or I forgot how that works. But anyway, that is what it should do. And maybe I'm just forgetting something. Oh, yeah, maybe that's the wrong thing here. Let me just try something that I'm not completely off the rails here. It looks better. We just, maybe the squiggles were actually an indicator that something goes wrong in front of the monitor. It was me who was having the problem. So now it looks much better, right? The minify markup formatter gives me something that's really down to the minimum. You also see that it removed the unnecessary HTML, etc., because those things were not used at all. And I think now the pretty markup formatter should actually work also quite well. Let's see. It looks much better now, right? So it really tries to use that, and I think it also would try to come up with something useful if we reduce the structure here. So again, that's just a representation. That's just the outcome, and you can also define it. I mean, if you use the standard one, it will always give you something that really represents the source. If you use the others, I mean, minify is also true to the source, right? So it really just tries to condense things, but otherwise it's true to the source. But here you get now something else, right? Because it really tries to, it is geared towards prettifying your code and not keeping the same result. So it's a little bit tricky thing. But anyway, the long story short, there are different formatters. You can roll out your own thing as long as it's implementing the right interface, right? Yeah, this way you can then define how a given document object model is transported over to HTML. Okay, I lost you there, or not?
Why? No.
Oh, okay.
You didn't lose me. I was just the whole time I was thinking, for this stuff in particular, raw strings are so nice because of the removal of indentation and all. That was my only thought. I don't know how I was looking, but I was not confused.
All good, all good. I mean, in general, I mean, you wouldn't see, in the standard use case of AngleSharp, you wouldn't see this string anyway, right? That's just something in the website, and you don't see that. You just load the website, and there you go. Okay, great. So this in mind, what else? So we are using here the default loader, but that's just the default thing. It's using the WebRequest underneath, which is a quite old way. It's not good. So if you want to use something more modern, for instance, using the HttpClient, you can, of course, install further libraries. So one thing that we have, and you can just look in AngleSharp what is out there. It's great. So we got, for instance, already a preview of AngleSharp CSS 1.0.0. That's cool.
And that is about the WebRequest stuff is because you're supporting
AngleSharp IO, right? So there is I mean, there are several things in there. One is modern I/O capabilities, for instance, making requests via the HttpClient. The other is it brings support for WebSockets and all that. That's actually unnecessary unless you couple a JavaScript engine to it, because suddenly you need to have these things that actually give you the WebSocket capability exposed in the document object model. And AngleSharp IO does all that. I hear you.
Hörst du mich?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Because I was just saying it was about WebRequest. Is this still used because of the support for older .NET frameworks? Or
yes,
gotcha.
Yeah. But even if we would drop the old .NET frameworks, I'm not sure if we would drop that. I mean, in general, I guess we would. But then the question is, what makes sense to still have all in AngleSharp IO? Because if all the things that remain are just, WebSocket, and there are some things for cookie handling in there, which I think still makes sense, but nevertheless. So that's another area. For instance, the standard loader that we have here, it uses the .NET cookie collections, and these are actually not good at all, unfortunately. They're not spec compliant, they're not following anything, they break easily, they have no capability of writing them out on the disk, for instance. So to really have, for instance, persistent cookies and things like that, things that you might want to have also for some reasons, right? So if you start a longer session and you want to be able to resume it, you might want to write them out or have an interceptor at least. And I think in AngleSharp IO, we have a quite best-in-class cookie container in there that follows the Netscape specification, which is still the reference for all the browsers today. It's quite remarkable, but they all reverse and that ended up being the spec. So we also implemented that, and that just makes cookies just work. And I mean, that sounds like an easy thing, but .NET cookies, I mean, they break even on some standard websites already. It's an area that, in my opinion, has a good example of improvement. URLs is another area where we use our own class because we.
Yeah, I was actually, that's, I will come back to that, or maybe you decide which question you first want to take. So my question is about, because I read a bit about this custom implementation of URL. So URI is not handling all the cases, as I read. I would be interested which cases these are. And a second question, I would just, and you pick the one that you want, from Eldroid or Eldroid, I don't know. Can I use AngleSharp to find out unused CSS? So 2 questions for you. Which one first?
Let's pick the one from the audience first. It's an interesting question, to be honest. You can use it because AngleSharp makes it possible. However, we don't bring in any utility. So you would need to do the matching right now. I mean, you see all the rules and everything in CSS, so you can then match them. We even have things implemented to go by each element and get the computed CSS out. So we have all the toolkit essentially, but we don't give you everything in, let's say, one command. But that would be a great improvement potentially to get that into a single command. I mean, use cases like that, just bring them up. Open an issue maybe on AngleSharp CSS if you want to see that, because then we can either, have the time and implement it already, or someone else might be interested in implementing it. And it would be really great to have these use cases assembled there, and then we can also implement them, because it's a great use case.
Okay, thanks. I was just in the same moment, I was looking if there are other tools, because it's an interesting task to do, to detect unused classes. I found one other solution also interesting, but actually Google just showed that, so I don't know. Okay, and about my question, URL versus URI. I read it supports more quirky kind of URLs, something.
So that's one of the reasons. The other is, of course, that we found out, I mean, especially with this quirky, right? So that there are, let's say, test suites out there that are used also by browsers to identify if they're doing the right thing. So, for instance, there's a test suite out for URLs. I don't know how many tests are in there, thousands. We usually port them over, and if we use them with the URL of .NET, I mean, pretty much 80% of them are failing. And the simple reason, I mean, it already starts that when the URL class detects something that doesn't seem right, it throws. I mean, that is good, but on the web, you need a little bit more resilience, and you need to make sense of something where you usually can't make sense of. So, I mean, we also, of course, we have an indicator if a URL has an error, because sometimes also in the web, you might want to identify that, and then, of course, don't make a request or something. But you never want an exception to be thrown in such circumstances. You want always to pass the most out of it, and then, for instance, in the case of URL, mark that the URL underneath has an error, as an example. But you don't want to throw an exception, because at this point you're dead. You can't do anything, right? You can't even say, well, up to this point now, that's where the exception was thrown, and so all the information gathered so far I take, you're not getting anything back, and that's I think the biggest problem in implementing something on top of URL. I mean, at the end of the day, quite often it was not that my desire to write a parser for everything. Like, I mean, there are media queries, there's CSS, there's this, there's that. You don't know where to start, where to stop. Pretty much everything comes up with its own syntax. So it's a nightmare essentially. But quite often, I mean, the problem is that if you don't do it, then something will just fail, because if you do it naively, I mean, the things out there on real websites, real web servers, I mean, they don't care. They send you something, and they don't expect you to throw exceptions or anything. And it's the same with HTML. It might come I don't know what I've seen, things that you would usually call attacks, DDoS in HTML, so to speak, where the parser can go rogue, but you need to handle all these cases, right? And yeah.
But I'm a bit more curious about the URL thing, because I mean that's a naive approach. But let's say you could just wrap the existing URI class, and then parsing just catch any exception, right? But is there? I mean, of course, not the best performant way, that's for sure. But are there any let's say remarkable cases that you would say exist that this implementation doesn't support, but which kind of should be supported or something?
Let me see if I can get one really fast. Just looking at the suite of test cases, because maybe we can just construct one on the fly. Let's see. I mean, it's been a long time since I implemented that. But in the best case, we can already just pick one. Let's see. URLs. Where is it? URLs. Yeah. Okay. URL validation. Let me see. There must be something really strange in there. Yeah. So I mean, we can already start. It is just the first one that I picked, but so the code that I picked actually, I don't know if I just paste it, if it works. So it has still an H here in front, so that I didn't copy. But what you can see here is this is like a single character, right? It's like a tab. I'm not actually sure if this is a real dot. They're printed the same way, but I'm not sure, right? So we got also other dots in there. And then we have a new line. And the expectation, for instance, for this thing is, and let me just then copy now this thing out of the, so in the code, in the test code base, it is written like this, so we don't have an anchor and all that. But what we can do is, of course, we can say var URL equals, what's the one from Yuri, I think, right? So,
Yuri, yeah.
Yeah. Do we need to say Yuri create, or does that also work just with the constructor? I think it should just work like this, right? Not sure though. Let's just see. I'm not sure if we will reach the console log anyway. So, but let's just say give me the absolute path or something. That doesn't matter right now. Okay, let's just fire. Let's just see what happens.
Yeah, it looks like an exception already.
Yeah. So, and of course, well, that's bad. And it's especially bad because there is, of course, an expectation. And the expectation is, let me just replace this.
So my expectation would be removing all white space characters.
Yeah, exactly. So essentially these things will be normalized, and the DNS name can't contain these special characters. So let me just print this thing here. Yeah, let's not just keep the other thing. But that should just work. I mean, it should anyway never throw an exception, but I mean, as you can see, we get the right URL out. And that's an example where, I mean, you might call this exotic. And of course it's exotic, right? I mean, sure. I mean, if that would be the standard case, then, I mean, that would be a bad job by Microsoft, right? But anyway, these are things that are found on real websites. I mean, I don't know who writes that, but
I still want to handle that, yeah, right. Without much, without much reparsing or adding just, all kinds of on-the-fly fixes. Yeah,
that's just the first case here in this test. This one suite. I opened one of the 5 dedicated test files that we have, and this one has for 5,000 lines, so like 20 lines per test, so you get the idea, right? It's there are many cases in there. Oh, this is also a funny one. It contains also some special replacement characters, and that's now an emoji. Oh no, that's a real emoji, I think. But anyways, there's another expectation for this one. Let's see. And,
so the emoji is the password.
But we get really something here, right? So by spec it must then transform it into these special characters. So it transforms it into hex, right? So this
URL encoded, perhaps. I don't know.
Maybe I don't know. No, yeah. I don't know. But I think it's something like that. I think the password also uses something like that for the special characters. But again, we could also, of course, go ahead and say, what about URI? I'm not sure that's handling that. It did something, but yeah, okay. It might be also right, but because we are not giving the. I think if we just make it toString, it's the same essentially as the. So let's just see what toString does on the URI. I forgot how it stringifies, but yeah, question marks there. Right? It's not what you expect.
Yeah, that's.
So it's right. Cases like this, right? It's again, it's not the standard cases, I would say. So the cases where URI anyway works, but it's really the cases where,
to be like you said about handling those cases gracefully, resilient. Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah, and I think performance-wise, we are not worse. It's definitely more work, I think, that we do, but I'm not sure now. Forgot. Well, I think it's quite in the same area. Might be better, might be a little bit worse, but it's in the same area, so it's quite good. Yeah.
I have something to talk about performance, but do you have anything else to show?
I mean, I'm pretty much going by the flow. So if you have anything else there or want to see something with CSS, we can go there. But otherwise, performance sounds great to me, right? So.
About performance, I should say, no, I'm not the best one to talk about performance per se. And I told you, I'm just saying this for the record, basically. Now I wanted to contribute something in terms of performance, but I have to say, just browsing through the code base, and also since I watched quite a lot of performance talks the past couple of days from Aaron Stannard and Daniel Marbach, it's so funny because I found these advices these two gave. I mean, those were the two talks that I watched. One-to-one I found in your code base, basically, like using array pool, for instance. What else? There was something else that I just now forgot, of course. But yeah,
string builder pool, aggressive inlining, things like that, right?
Aggressive inlining, stuff like that. Yeah, exactly. So I gave my best, but and I already told you, I begged Martin for taking a look with me. So we will do this at some point, definitely, and then see if we can find something. But I still have to say, and that's what I wanted to point out, AngleSharp, the code base itself, looks so sophisticated with an eye on those performance critical things. So I just want to say good job about this, basically.
Thanks.
Very great job.
Yeah, I think we could still improve in some areas. It's always, I mean, these things, tend to get massive from a memory footprint. And I think this is an area where, I mean, at the end of the day, it's also, I wouldn't call it physics, but you have this document and you want to translate into these nodes. And if this document contains, I don't know, 1,000 diffs, I mean, you end up with 1,000 nodes. So there's not much you can do there, right? But the question is then, of course, especially, let's say, on a GC pressure point of view, do they need all the links? How are you managing this graph? How can you still make it easy to traverse in things like a CSS selector or the CSS selector query topics and all of that? how are you handling the extra information? There are things on some nodes, like for instance, shadow root, right? This is just an example that I bring up. You would need to mark on each, if you just naively mark on each node that, you know, there is a potential shadow root, you still already pay the, let's say 8 bytes, 4 to 8 bytes for this pointer that points to null in like 99% of the cases, let's say 100% of the cases. So if you have 1,000 divs, you suddenly lose, I don't know, 8 megabytes just to nothing, nothing. And that's a huge problem, right? And so what you can do is, to, for instance, work with tables, work with lazy reference, where you say, well, instead of having always, of course, this information at each node, I just keep a table at the document level where the shadow roots with their associated elements are there. And you, of course, need to have a weak reference. Otherwise, again, GC pressure, right? And you can never release it. So things like that become suddenly really important, that you think about what's the standard case, what information do I need to keep, what information can I compute, and do I need to have it, let's say, at the element level or the node level, or could I put it somewhere else where it just then has less pressure? And I mean, that's quite difficult actually in AngleSharp. And I think, I think at a good point, but it could always be improved. So any contribution there is much appreciated.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And another thing that I saw was, and it reminded me of Michael Stipe also, working on hot chocolate. Because I saw so many, and he's also working with a Blazor /parser, comparing bytes by bytes basically, and then just the hex values standing next to the equals sign and all that stuff. So yeah, it's very interesting endeavor, I think.
Yeah, even though we usually have them in the const tables there, right? And then we just say symbols dot so that we don't get freaky there. But at the end of the day, that we have the hex codes there is less that we are purists. I mean, I could use also octal or something. I don't care. I think we just use the same values as they're given in the spec. Just makes it easier later on, right? When we need to look back at the spec and say, well, did we forget a symbol? Then we can just look it up and say, oh, that was the same, just with one view, right? You don't need them to change the base or anything, right? That's all. Quite often, I mean, you could also copy a tab and have it there as a jar, but I mean, it's of course, or have \t or something, use the escape sequence, but it just makes sense when they are talking the spec and they're using the ASCII code for it and in hex, and we are using also the ASCII code in hex. And so it's just aligned with the spec, makes it reading and understanding easier. Need to think less. It's always good when I need to think less. less room for mistakes, and that's why I try to minimize the thinking.
Since you mentioned it, the spec once more, how can I imagine that? Like, how big is the spec? How frequently does it change, or what additions are there? That would be interesting.
Yeah, depending on what you look at, it's huge. The thing is, I mean,
are we talking pages, books, or?
There's not just one spec, right? So there's the spec for HTML5, essentially. And that one is also divided in certain areas. So for instance, parsing, right? But so there's this parsing, and you can expect, so depending where you look at, are you interested already in the things that will come, already in the things that should be there since a long time, or in the things that should be now coming in? So, I mean, there are these levels of a spec where they say this is a first draft, this is in candidate recommendation, and so on. So I forgot how they named all this, but I think there are like 5 levels. And for instance, even HTML5 has just reached like, was it 6 years or so ago? So the 5.0 specification has reached like candidate recommendation. There was a recommendation, but the browsers did implement it at this point already since like 5 years. So it takes like 5-6 years for a spec to come from a point where everyone already implements. So let's call it production ready to, let's call it a recommendation. That takes like 5 to 6 years. So so if you always want to be at the, let's say, latest, so the things that will now enter or have just entered the browser, I mean, you can look at their, I wouldn't say daily, but it can change like weekly. And even, I mean, I just look at it at the spec. I mean, earlier on, I looked at it much more often, but these days, maybe once per year or half a year. And there are some changes. It can be quite annoying to identify these changes, right? So what we tried, especially with, I think, the URL spec, is to have a dump of it that we can easily compare it. But that doesn't work for all the specs. And so URL, for instance, its own spec, right? To work with it. There are more specs. And the thing that is really terrible is CSS. Because CSS stopped having a specification with 2.1. That was the last time CSS had a specification. And then they moved over. So CSS 3 is all a big lie, right? CSS 3 is a combination of different specs. So the selector spec, the color spec, etc., media queries. So you got different specs for different areas of CSS, and they move in their own pace. It's a little bit like micro frontends again. But it makes it very, very difficult for me now as an implementer of CSS in quotes to say this is it, right? Because you don't get that. Also, let's say this box model, etc., all these things, they are not there for rendering. There's a different spec again, and there's no concise thing because since they broke up, they have now flexbox grids, etc., so different display modi, which are different specs. So there is not the one spec that says this is how you can render CSS. That's the last spec for it was the 2.1 spec. Since then, there is nothing. So when people say CSS 4 will be the next big thing, I'm saying, which part of it? Because colors are long in level 4. I think they're already level 5. Selectors have passed level 4 already, so they're also level 5 is there. And I mean, media queries are, I don't know, level 2, level 3. And they're all in different levels, different parts of CSS. There are new parts coming in. So there is not this one thing. That makes it very hard because it's such a huge target area with moving parts that move. I mean, if you look at all the specs, they move certainly daily, maybe even hourly, right? So it's crazy. You can't, I mean, this is one of the reasons why there isn't a new browser all the time. Why is there just, let's say, WebKit powers Safari, for instance, Blink, which powers Chrome and all of that, and the Gecko engine, there's no other engine, right? I mean, some people sometimes try and they get something like Servo out, which then would be a new engine, but they still failed one or the other tests. Well, the reason is simple. It's just so massive to do. You would need a large engineering team, and they would always be behind. That is also the reason why Microsoft abandoned the browser engine, right? So they said, let's just use what they give us and let's just make everything on top. Like, let's bring in this AI assistant and so on. And that's how we win at the end, by not doing something in the real engine. It's a complicated thing.
I was just taking a look because I have no idea. I don't do web usually, except with you. I was just taking a look. So CSS2 is specifications from 1998. Is that right? So it's quite old. I have to say, I mean, that was roughly the time, maybe a few years more, when I started to dive into computer programming. Well, HTML. Some people don't call it programming, but that was my entry drug, let's say. But meanwhile, what you can do with CSS is absolutely crazy. I think for everyone who hasn't seen it, like if you search for CSS acrobatics or something, you can see all kinds of crazy things. Like on what is this website called, CodePen, where they show their masterpieces. So
crazy.
Yeah.
CSS is the hardest thing in the world, if you ask me. So this is really, there is no master of CSS. I mean, it's a zoo, and it's
CSS deserves the cup, and by cup I mean the CSS cup where everything is not in place, not centered, no nothing. So there's another question, and again I would say Eldroid or Eldroid. Hypothetically, we can build the HTML in AngleSharp and use it as view renderer.
Yes.
What this reminds me of, and I actually forgot, or maybe it's even better to ask at the very end here. So AngleSharp is also used in a couple of other products that or projects that people use. Can you name a few? Because I think for some people it might be interesting.
So I think one of the things that really work out well is, I mean, that AngleSharp is used in other libraries and helper things. So we got, for instance, a pre-mailer, which is an email sanitizer, right? So that you can get your sanitize emails and get unwanted HTML or potentially things that lead to, let's say, security risks out there. And another thing where it's also used as a library, so it's a jumping point for another library, is bUnit. They are using AngleSharp in a custom package called AngleSharp diffing. So bUnit is used, for instance, in Blazor to unit test. AngleSharp was also, I think, part of Blazor initially. I don't think they use this anymore. It was just in the beginning to get the model nicely out. Maybe they still do it. I'm not sure. I mean, at least I'm not talking to the people at Microsoft and tell me we use it there, but I think they moved it out. I mean, they use something more lightweight, and that makes sense, of course, for them. Where it was used, again, I'm not contacted by the team, so I don't know if that's still the case, was the Azure app for also the mobile phones. So they were writing it, was AngleSharp used also behind the scenes, and a couple of these larger things. So I'm usually just hearing, by third parties from them and not by the actual users, which is sometimes a little bit sad, because it would be great if you just say, hey, we use it there. That also would not only give me more motivation, but also, of course, if you know your user base, you can better interact with them and say, hey, there is something interesting out there, like would you be interested in certain additional CSS utilities, like what we've heard, finding unnecessary CSS or something. And then, of course, that could prioritize certain development. That's only possible, of course, if you know the users.
Yeah, that's very interesting what you said, and I totally get where you're coming from about this. Basically, many open source projects, they're just building blocks, and then you can build something even greater, or from that, not even greater, but equally great from that, with using several building blocks. Yeah, I was just looking, and in fact, Steve Sanderson repository, Blazor. One folder on the source is AngleSharp, so it was just at that time, I guess, for trying it out, copy pasted and used there. Also about bUnit, that was so fun to hear, because last time we met at a conference and we talked, because I promised for a long time we will have this format here. And then we talked a bit, and I also said that I will have the maintainer of bUnit here. I don't dare to pronounce his first name because I have no idea.
Agile.
You know how?
I mean, I have this, or Egil Hansen, what the Agile I always call him. I'm not sure if he would agree that this is the English pronunciation, but this is one more reason to have him on the show, right? So
I will. We are in contact already, so he will be one of the next guests. Not sure if the next one already or right after the next one that's coming. Not sure yet, but it's quite interesting to see this. That I guess bUnit does ring more of a bell than AngleSharp, probably. I hope that's fair to say to a lot of people, particularly also because Blazor is so hyped right now. And I think, and I mentioned this once or again, but I hope I'm not saying anything wrong. But I also used to work in a company who did an open source framework as a byproduct, and that was used in Entity Framework for some time, or some other related library. But I'm, let's say, 90% sure it was an Entity Framework. Didn't use it at the time. Later they might also have removed it and replaced with their own implementation. But yeah, I mean, that's something. Yeah, quite interesting. Okay, that's it in terms of questions. I have maybe one more personal question, or not personal, but a question from me. I read something about JavaScript support. How does that look?
Yeah, we stopped. So it worked well until we stopped supporting it. I mean, some things worked, not everything works. The thing is, for JavaScript support, you need a couple of things. So the first is you need an additional JavaScript engine. What we went for here is a great project called Jint, so JavaScript interpreted, and where implements ECMAScript 5, so that's a spec from long ago, which is also fine up to some degree because, I mean, people at this point in time still support Internet Explorer and so on, so it was still very, very common format. They are working on ECMAScript 6 and some other things. I think it's not yet ready. Might be close to it. I'm always getting a little bit of information on that, but I'm now not sure. Anyway, so this is the one part. But then you have a bare JavaScript engine, right? That comes already with, of course, execution of JavaScript. It knows maybe the basic API, things like the math object, set intervals, set timeout, that's it. So everything that's defined there. So syntax and basic API. But then all the document object model, like interacting with document, making query selector and all that, that needs now to come from the browser engine itself. So for this, we have in AngleSharp some special attributes, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to, you know, if you just throw it over right now, you get everything with the capital layers, right? So you would get query selector with a capital Q instead of the lowercase q. That's not what you want, of course, in a JavaScript model. So how is the real name? You don't know, right? But we already have it placed in, let me go there, and have it in there as an attribute called the DOM name. So you can read it out programmatically. You could also read it out statically, right, at build time or something, and create what I would call the wiring, right? So how you now relate your .NET objects with their .NET method names, etc., into the JavaScript world, into potentially some proxy object, right? So this is a little bit similar how the browsers also work. They have the native things, so the document object model, native API down there, but then they have, of course, the thing that they expose. So this is then using query selector. Now, that's just a proxy, and it does then something native under the hood. Potentially, that they also call it an internally query selector or something else, maybe a more cryptic name, but it just dispatches there, right? So all it does is it tries to get the arguments over, get them from the JavaScript types into the native types, or in this case, .NET types, execute whatever should be done, and then, of course, converting it back to the desired return value in JavaScript. So that's then what this wiring is up, right? So wire it all together. And then, you, as mentioned, you can do here these DOM names and everything, like also the I element is fully, it has also DOM name, right? So that's just element, something you can find. And sorry again for the mouse, just realized it's the doubling effect is back again. But it tells you everything that's in there and all that, right? So the model that we use in .NET can be transported over pretty easily into the JavaScript world. So the wiring can, with some effort, of course, happen more or less automatically. But then there's a third component missing, and that's the execution model that also comes. Because just because you have a JavaScript engine doesn't mean that, it just now runs the same way as in the browser. The browser runs the JavaScript single-threaded in a so-called reactor model, and usually you have an event loop behind that, right? So that always runs the JavaScript, sees if something else is in the event loop, runs the JavaScript with these things, sees what else is in the event loop. So that's this reactor thing. And usually the JavaScript engine doesn't do that. It just runs some JavaScript, but then when it's run, it's done, right? So you need to couple it to this reactor. We also have a reactor in there, but yeah, it's honestly speaking not a good one. And if you would look at something like Node.js or Dino, right, that are using libuv or Tokyo, so these are then real event loops. They are quite sophisticated to implement and to handle. We would need something like that as well in .NET, not our simple implementation that just uses task and then polls and that's it. But long story short, It was working. We stopped supporting, I think, since version 0.16 or 0.17, but we want to get it back as a 1.0.0, and then with the new version of Gint that is incompatible with the old one. So it changed under the hood quite some things, I think for the better in general, but that just is for us work to do the wiring again, right? It's, just changed. But in general, it was quite cool for demos as well, because then you could just see some simple JavaScript on website, and suddenly that also runs. I mean, at the end, it runs, of course, .NET code, because if you do DOM manipulation, that's the DOM that you've created in .NET, so it does .NET manipulation, and that was quite neat, actually. Also things like set timeout and set interval, but I mean, they would anyway work in Gint out of the box, but suddenly doing DOM manipulation with a set interval, yeah, I think it's quite neat.
So that would automatically translate to task delay or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, what Gint does under the hood, I'm not sure if they do already something. So ideally, it doesn't do a task delay, but it actually works against the event loop, right? And then this event loop defines it. Right now, what it would do in AngleSharp, when coupled to our simple event loop, it would use task delay, right? But ideally, it would be more sophisticated than that. And it needs to go against the event loop, definitely, because this is what the real JavaScript also does, right? So it does set timeout, and that means, oh, you have a callback. I need to store it now in the event loop that it pops up later, and there I use a native timer for that. Yeah, that's how this should behave.
See, that's just case in point, because I didn't, I didn't know about Gint before. I was just Googling, and yeah, that's another project maintained by Sebastian Ross. Yeah. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And yeah, just basically powering also AngleSharp, in that way.
AngleSharp, yes. Yeah.
And I see only 2 crosses actually, what's not supported, generators and tail calls. For all the rest, I see a check mark there.
Yeah, but yeah, it's coming in hot.
I'll add a star for this as well.
Yeah,
maintainers deserve it.
Yeah,
and that's also funny. You know, I frequently see similar names for those people that maintain the project. Like in AngleSharp, I also saw Simon Kropp again committing. He has a lot. You also have a lot on the side as well. I'm not sure. Pyro is also open source, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
So I would just read from the Google search result, the ultimate micro front-end framework. Yeah. So if people are interested in that, then go check that out as well. And as far as I know, or as far as I can see, no other questions, and we are also almost hitting the limit here. It was really great talking to you. I have to admit, I had no idea before. I mean, I was, again, honest. I'm watching talks before, other talks that go in the same direction. But it was really interesting talking about all of this. Thanks for your time. Yeah, I promise I keep in touch with Martin about the performance investigations. What else? Was there anything else I wanted to say? Thank you also in the name of everyone using it. Yeah, I will share my screen again if you're okay.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was a blast. I hope it was not too confusing and that we,
I understood something, so I think others took away something as well. So to give a bit of an outro, among today's episode with Florian, we have a website. If you search for JetBrains open source power-ups, with all the episodes that we had so far, this was with Florian the 11th one. So I'm looking forward to have more of these. And if you're interested, go there, check out some of the other episodes. If you're using Serilog, I mean, a lot of people will use logging, and Serialog is probably these days the most popular one. Verify, here we have him, Simon Kropp, yeah, we just talked about him. And yeah, maybe if you're interested, just take another look at these episodes. We will have a new one in a couple of months, 1 or 2 months, something like that. It might be the maintainer of bUnit already. Let's see if we can agree on a date. Other than that, let me go back here. So if you want to follow up, yeah, then there you go. All the resources on Twitter, YouTube, our blog, but also for Florian's AngleSharp project and his personal account. If you have more questions, like for people who watch after the live stream, then go there. Or even better, if you have ideas for contributions and the like, then probably feel free. Yeah, I guess Florian agrees. And yeah, once more, thanks for joining. Thanks again, Florian, for being here. Was an honor. And everyone else, see you next time. And thanks for tuning in as well. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye.